How we doing today, everybody? I'm Adam, this is Cattle Dog Garage and Racing. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Now let's get into it. Though not the best way to build power, more exhaust duration will increase power production above 3,500 RPMs or above peak torque, and will typically allow the engine to carry power longer past peak. But depending on how much exhaust duration over the intake duration, there comes a point when exhaust duration will negatively affect torque production and decrease power below 3,500 RPMs. Also, in an inoptimal situation, it may also be necessary to increase exhaust duration to aid cylinder evacuation with low-flowing exhaust ports or restrictive exhaust systems. But this is just a band-aid for the root issue and will never be optimal. So now this brings us to our next dyno data point about the use of optimal LSA and exhaust duration, which means optimal timing of the intake valve opening position, overlap placement, intake valve close position, and the proper use of exhaust duration or earlier exhaust valve opening and later exhaust valve closing, which, as I previously stated and displayed in my first cam video, exhaust duration will increase torque and horsepower above 3,500 RPMs or above peak torque and make more torque and horsepower while typically allowing the engine to carry RPM longer past peak torque and horsepower. The only downside to this is there is a point where it will decrease torque and horsepower below peak torque, and this is exactly what separated the first and third place cams in the 23 cam competition. The first place cam, which was the orange line, was the 108 LSA with 238 intake, 259 exhaust, and the third place cam, which is the blue line, was a 108 LSA with 235 intake, 247 exhaust. Both first and third place cams had very near the same intake valve opening position within 1 degree, and the intake valve closing events were within 2 degrees, but the exhaust valve opening and closing events were a lot earlier and later, both exhaust events being about 6 and 7 degrees difference on the 238-259 cam versus the 235-247 cam. Therefore, the 238-259 cam, with its 6 degrees earlier exhaust valve opening position and its 6 degrees later exhaust valve closing position, it started to expel exhaust gases from the cylinder earlier, emptying the cylinder more completely, which led to more efficient evacuation of the cylinder above 4,700 RPMs. This is due to the pressure differential occurring at the correct time, along with there being more of a pressure differential when the intake valve is opening, which simply means that the exhaust valve opening position and exhaust valve close position evacuated the cylinder more completely, which created more of a pressure drop in the cylinder. This then allowed the optimally placed intake valve opening position and overlap placement to take better advantage of the cylinder head and more efficiently fill the cylinder, which in turn allows the intake valve closing position to take advantage of an optimally filled cylinder. Now, as you can see, the 235-247 cam obviously made more torque and horsepower below peak torque and made a little less peak torque and horsepower, just as one would expect. The 238-259 cam, which once again is the orange line, made less torque and horsepower below peak, but the early opening and late closing exhaust valve event helped make more peak torque, more peak horsepower, and more torque and horsepower past peak, just as expected. Now, if the 235-247 cam had 10 to 13 degrees more exhaust duration, there would have been 2 cams that made more power across the entire RPM range than all the other cams with almost identical power curves. Now let's bring in the 109 LSA 247-263 cam that got third place, which is going to be the green line. Now this is once again just another beautiful display of what I've been saying in this video, in my last 2 videos, about optimal valve event timing starting with optimal LSA. Now there are obviously other ways of coming to this conclusion for valve events, but if your intake valve opening position, overlap placement, and intake valve close position are not in the correct location, no amount of overlap, duration, lift, advance, or fancy load profiles will help you recover the loss in trap volumetric efficiency or torque and horsepower production across the entire RPM range, period, which is a rarely known but proven fact I've known about for over 25 years, and now I'm trying to share this knowledge with you in these videos. Without an optimal lobe separation angle, you will not make the most torque and horsepower across the entire RPM range, period. Now notice that both cams on 108 LSAs made more torque and horsepower everywhere, up until 6100 RPMs where the 109, 247, 263 cam with 37 degrees of overlap at 50 thousandths finally gained more power than the 108, 235, 247 cam, but only due to the bias of the overlap triangle and the placement of the exhaust valve opening and closing position. As you can see with your own eyes, without optimal placement of the intake valve opening position, overlap placement, and intake valve close position, the 109 LSA 247 263 cam didn't even make more peak torque than the 235 247 cam on an optimal 108 LSA. Now also, as you can see, the 235 247 cam on the optimal 108 LSA even carried peak torque longer than the 109 247 263 cam, and the 235 247 cam on a 108 LSA only has 25 degrees overlap at 50 thousandths, while the 109 247 263 cam has 37 degrees overlap at 50 thousandths. The data in this video just destroyed the common held belief amongst a vast majority of people and many professionals that the tighter LSA, even with equal overlap or more overlap, will make more peak torque, make more torque and horsepower below peak, but will make less peak horsepower and always fall off first after peak before the wider LSA, which is clearly not the case as you can see here and as I showed earlier. Hell, the 108, 238, 259 cam only has 32.5 degrees overlap at 50 thousandths, and the 109, 247, 263 cam has 37 degrees overlap. But the 108, 238, 259 cam still made more torque and horsepower everywhere across the entire curve. So for those of you that keep saying the 108, 238, 259 cam got first place because of the overlap, or that so-and-so didn't do good in the competition because they didn't have enough overlap, or that the degrees of overlap is more important than lobe separation angle, intake valve opening position, overlap placement, and intake valve close position, it's been proven on the dyno that 1 degree of lobe separation angle has a 500% larger effect on torque and horsepower production than a 1 degree change in intake valve close position or a 2 degree change in duration. So if you're hung up on overlap solely, and that is your thought process, I would really start to question my cognitively biased afflictions and what I think I know, because this is once again unbiased data that just proves otherwise. And for those of us who live in reality, accurate data don't lie. So with that said, you're poorly mistaken with your incorrect or incomplete information you perceive to be true and complete knowledge. Yes, overlap is extremely important, but you can only use so much overlap for a given task, and overlap means absolutely nothing when it's not placed in the optimal location, in combination with optimally timed valve events and area within the overlap triangle, as you can clearly see here in this data. Now, if the third place 108 LSA 239 intake duration cam had a 257 exhaust duration instead of a 247, we would be seeing two cams making the most power across the entire curve, and the second place cam, which was the 109, 247, 263, would have been third place because, as you can see, the 109, 247, 263 only got second place due to it using 263 degrees of exhaust duration. Second place only beat third place, the 108, 235, 247 cam, above 6100 RPMs due to the effects of exhaust valve events. Now also notice the display of the intake side being able to effectively utilize power increases from the exhaust valve events on the 238, 259 cam, with the 108 LSA being as it has the advantage of optimally timed intake valve opening position, overlap placement, and intake valve closing position. This is displayed in the power curves produced by the 238, 259 cam on a 108 LSA versus the 109, 247, 263 cam. The effects from the exhaust valve events come into effect much sooner at 4900 RPMs with the 108, 238, 259 cam compared to 6100 RPMs for the 109, 247, 263 cam. Video. Now this brings us to our next data points, all of which are prime examples of the effect of the valve events, gas dynamics, and the increase in torque and horsepower produced across the entire curve by a camshaft with an optimal lobe separation angle and overlap placement. This data once again goes against the typical or conventional understanding of valve events and primarily the effects produced by changes in lobe separation angle. This engine right here was a 10-to-1 350 cubic inch small block Chevy with AFR 195cc heads with 202 intake valves, 1.6 exhaust valves, and 1.5 rockers. It also had a Victor Jr. single plane intake manifold and a 750 carb. Not exactly the combination of parts I would have chose, but anyway. This engine was tested with 5 cams on LSAs ranging from 114, 112, 110, 108, and 106. Each cam had 235 degrees intake duration at 50 thousandths and 240 degrees exhaust duration at 50 thousandths, with 500 thousandths lift on both the intake and exhaust. Now, as you can clearly see, the cam on the 108 LSA, which is the orange line, made the most torque and horsepower across the entire RPM range, even more than the cam on the 106 LSA, which a vast majority of the industry's professionals, including Billy Godbold, hold the belief that the 106, or even a tighter LSA of say a 102, would have made a more torque and horsepower everywhere, but would have made less peak horsepower, along with horsepower and torque falling off first. For example, like the results produced by the 101 LSA, which is the blue line in this test, of a 10.5-to-1 406 cubic inch small block Chevy. Now notice the 101 made the most low RPM torque and horsepower, the most peak torque and mid-range horsepower, but at the top of the RPM range, it failed to make the most peak horsepower, and torque and horsepower actually fell off first. This is typical for an LSA that is what would be considered too tight. The 101 fell off first because it opened the intake valve too soon, which resulted in flow not being presented to the cylinder at the correct time, which resulted in incomplete cylinder filling at higher RPM. At high RPM, when the intake valve's opening too soon, it ends up pulling more combustible charge out of the exhaust during the overlap period. This is called over-scavenging the cylinder. This is a result of incorrect placement of overlap due to the intake valve opening position. This in combination with too much overlap and the intake valve closing sooner, which also increases cylinder pressure, and in turn evacuates the cylinder more rapidly because of the increase in expansion ratio, which then in turn acts on the intake harder, which further increases the amount of combustible intake charge being expelled out of the exhaust, which then results in a reduction in high RPM trapped volumetric efficiency. All of this, in turn, ends up reducing peak horsepower and the RPM at which peak horsepower is produced. This dyno sheet was just an example of the standard effects of random changes in LSA. You can get more information on that specific subject in my last cam video, which I highly recommend watching. Anyway, back to the effects of optimal valve events. So as you can clearly see, with the 108 LSA being optimal for this 10-to-1 350 cubic inch small block Chevy, it made 24 horsepower more at peak than the cam on the 112 LSA, and 21 horsepower more than the cam on the 114, just like I've been saying would happen. The common held majority amongst the vast majority of pros is that the 112 or the 114 would make more peak horsepower than the 108, which is obviously a very common misconception and is obviously not reality. Now also notice that 24 horsepower increase in peak horsepower from the 108 versus the 112 was from only a 4-degree change in LSA, which is a prime example of what I said earlier about a 1-degree change in LSA having a 500% greater effect on torque and horsepower production than just a 1-degree change in intake valve close position alone. You will not get that 24 horsepower increase from a 4-degree change in intake valve closing position alone in a combination like this. The statement I just made is clearly not just an opinion. Just like everything else I've said in this video, it's empirical and is absolute fact, being as what I've just said has been proven on the dyno thousands and thousands of times over and over again. Now to the calculation for the optimal 108 LSA for this 10-to-1 350 cubic inch small block Chevy with a 202 intake valve and a 1.5 rocker ratio. The cylinder heads on this engine had a low lift discharge coefficient below 0.75, so it uses the standard constant of 128. So the calculation would be 350 divided by 8 divided by 202 times 0.91, which will give us 19.709. Then we subtract that from 128 and we get a 108 LSA, which as you can clearly see is making the most torque and horsepower across the entire RPM range over all the other cams. Now, since we're doing calculations, it's time to show that LS engines and small block Chevys share the 128 constant as I said earlier, but the constant may need to be adjusted for the use of LS3 heads. due to them having at least a low lift discharge coefficient varying between 0.76 and 0.78. So now let's refer back to the 11.5 to 1 compression 408 cubic inch LS engine with 11 degree Pro Max LS3 cylinder heads. Now also note, as I've said in my other videos, this engine will require an adjustment for compression ratio, being as compression and expansion ratios are one of the most influential factors in the placement of valve event timing, overlap triangle, and optimal lobe separation angle. So now if we start with the 128 constant for this 408 cubic inch LS3 and adjust the constant for the discharge coefficient being over 0.75, because these 11 degree Pro Max LS3 cylinder heads have a discharge coefficient between 0.76 and 0.78. So we will increase the 128 to a 129 for the discharge coefficient. Now if we take 408 divided by 8 divided by 2.165 and times that by 0.91, that'll give us 21.436. Then we minus that from 129 and we get 107.5. Then, as I have said in my other 2 cam videos, we add 1 degree for the 11.5 compression being 1 whole point of compression above 10.5, which equates to a 108.5 LSA, which just so happens to literally be the exact same LSA as the 108.5 238 259 cam that won Eric's Camshaft challenge. Need I say more? Now with that said, you could obviously use a plain 108 LSA. It wouldn't necessarily have to be a 108.5 to produce the power increase across the entire RPM range. Now next up, here's another example of another 400 plus cubic inch LS3 starting with the 128 constant. This dyno data is from a 10.5 to 1 402 cubic inch LS with CNC ported Chevrolet Performance LS3 cylinder heads. These of course have a 2.165 intake valve and also have a low lift flow discharge coefficient between 0.76 and 0.78. All the cams tested in this data had 232 degrees intake duration, 242 exhaust duration, and 624 thousandths lift on both the intake and exhaust. Now as you can clearly see once again that the cam on the 108 LSA being optimal, it's making the most torque and horsepower across the entire RPM range over both the cams on the 112 and the 120 LSAs, with about 18 horsepower more past peak. Now with that said, let's do the LSA calculation. So we start with the 128 constant, then we adjust the constant for the LS3 cylinder head's discharge coefficient being above 0.75. So now the constant is 129. So we take 402 divided by 8 divided by 2.165 times 0.91, which equals 21.121. Then we minus that from 129, which gives us 107.87. Then we round that up to 108, and bingo bango, we have the beginning of optimal valve event timing for this engine, as you can clearly see in this dyno data. Now since I've shown how to calculate the optimal lobe separation angle, we will have to make a few more calculations, and those calculations will start with either mine or DV's equation for duration. They both produce the same result, but mine is simplified, and unlike DV's, which is intended to do just overlap or total overlap and advertised duration, my equation does total overlap, advertised duration, overlap at 50 thousandths, and duration at 50 thousandths. My personal equation I created is LSA times 2 plus overlap equals duration. So for example, let's say we have a 108 LSA and we've determined that an engine needs 33 degrees overlap at 50 thousandths and 88 degrees overlap total. So we will go 108 times 2 equals 216 plus 33 degrees of overlap equals 249 degrees. That 249 degrees would be our intake and exhaust duration. Now we could simply keep it a single pattern camshaft that specs out 249, 249, or we could make it a dual pattern cam and say take 11 degrees from the 249 intake duration, so the intake duration would then be 238. Then we add that 11 degrees we took from the intake duration to the 249 on the exhaust duration, so now the exhaust duration is 260 degrees. So now we have a 238, 260 at 50 thousandths with that same 33 degrees overlap at 50 thousandths maintained. Now as I said earlier, we have determined we needed an 88 degrees overlap total to achieve the RPM range for a given cubic inch engine on this example. So then we go 108 times 2 equals 216 plus 88 degrees of overlap, and that'll give us 304 degrees. Now this gives us a 108 LSA 304 advertised, but since we're doing a split pattern camshaft, we will take that 304 on the intake and remove 11 degrees intake duration. So the intake duration is now 293 degrees. And now we add that 11 degrees from the intake duration to the 304 on the exhaust. Now the exhaust is 315 degrees. This gives us a 108 LSA, 238, 260 at 50 thousandths, 293, 315 at 6 thousandths, while maintaining the 33 degrees overlap at 50 thousandths and the 88 degrees overlap total. Now note, with the duration being 238, 260 at 50, and 293, 315 at 6 thousandths, this combination of duration produces a hydraulic intensity on the intake and exhaust lobes of 55. Rocker ratio would also come into play here for optimal valve motion, but that's a subject for a completely different video. Now also note, with this cam, let's say we've decided that it needs 4 degrees advance ground into the intake lobe, so the intake center line will be 104. Now for those of you who may be thinking, well, it's all about the valve events. What about the valve events? Well, just because you've managed to stick around so long through this video, now I'm going to show how I calculate every single valve event, along with the degrees of total overlap and overlap at 50 thousandths from the cam specs we just came up with, which I've never seen anybody else do on the internet. So to start with, we'll calculate the exhaust center line. The equation to calculate the exhaust center line is exhaust center line equals LSA plus LSA minus intake center line. So we will go 108 LSA minus 104 intake center line equals 4 degrees. Then we'll add that 4 degrees to the 108 LSA, which gives us the 112 exhaust center line. Now we're going to calculate the intake valve opening position. So we will take intake duration divided by 2 minus intake center line. So we will go 238 divided by 2 equals 119 minus 104 degree intake center line equals 15. This gives us an intake valve opening position of 15 degrees before top dead center. Next we will calculate the exhaust valve closed position. Then we'll go exhaust duration divided by 2 minus exhaust center line. So we will go 260 divided by 2 equals 130 minus 112 equals 18. This gives us an exhaust valve closed position of 18 degrees after top dead center. Now we're going to calculate the intake valve closed position. So we go intake duration minus intake valve opening position, which is 15 degrees before top dead center, plus 180 equals 195. So we take 238 minus 195 equals 43 degrees. This gives us a intake valve closed position of 43 degrees after bottom dead center. Now last, we need to calculate the exhaust valve opening position. So we take the exhaust valve closed position, which was 18 degrees after top dead center, plus 180, which gives us 198. Then we take exhaust duration, which was 260, minus 198 gives us 62. So we have an exhaust valve opening position of 62 degrees before bottom dead center. So the cam specs are 238, 260 at 50 thousandths, 293, 315 at 6 thousandths on a 108 LSA, and the lobes have a hydraulic intensity of 55. And the valve events we have calculated for this cam are intake valve opening position at 15 degrees before top dead center, exhaust valve closed position 18 degrees after top dead center, intake valve closed position of 43 degrees after bottom dead center, and an exhaust valve opening position of 62 degrees before bottom dead center. This cam also has an intake center line of 104 and an exhaust center line of 112. This cam was very, very close to the one I would have entered into the cam challenge had I had money. Now I'm going to show how to calculate overlap of a camshaft based off these cam specs. So we take intake duration plus exhaust duration. So that's 238 plus 260 equals 498 divided by 2 equals 249. Then we take 249 minus the 108 LSA times 2 equals 216. So 249 minus 216 equals 33 degrees of overlap at 50 thousandths. Then we do that again with advertised duration. So we go 293 plus 315 equals 608 divided by 2 equals 304 minus a 108 LSA times 2 equals 216. So 304 minus 216 equals 88 degrees of overlap. Now, after all this dyno data, along with me showing and explaining all this information that isn't on the internet or anywhere else that I know of for that matter, all related to valve events, the empirical process of valve event timing starting with optimal LSA and overlap placement, and everything else that I've shown and explained, if you live in actual reality, there's no denying that valve events aren't the main focus in this process, no matter what anybody says or how their cognitively biased afflictions make them perceive it. If you are